I long predicted that 1993 will be the best year for the Amiga games. Or was the best year, really. Anyway, here we are in a video that's over 70 titles strong, that I have no way of knowing yet as I record this, but I predict that it will crash my editing PC at least twice while rendering. Anyway, when it comes to this magnificent year, many things have happened, but most important were the CERN releasing the web source code and in the process accelerating the growth of internet tenfold over what seemed like a day or two. Bill Clinton helped in creation of .gov and .org domains and put White House on the net, allowing general public to directly email the president, so himself, vice president and the first lady, which I have no doubt was abused within seconds of becoming public knowledge. In the same year, PowerPC CPU was introduced and used near exclusively by the new line of Apple's PowerMacs. And last but not least, general proof of work concept was introduced, and while it may have not been used widely then, now is a very important baseline for little thing that we know as Bitcoin mining earnings. And it's the time when I usually ask you to smash that like button and hit subscribe. Despite what you may feel like, it's actually a huge help. You may also consider joining my Patreon, but you do you. These videos will always be free here anyway, just a day later than on Patreon, same as they've been since day one. There are some other perks there too, but like I said, it's totally voluntary. Okay, before I get to the point, I'd like to give credit where it's due. Some of the footage for this video was sampled in small parts from other channels. It's either because I couldn't get the particular game to run, or it would have taken a lot of time to get to the point that I wanted to show, or finally, because I suck at that game and it was just more feasible to show someone who can actually play it. One way or another, all those incredible channels are credited both with a blue ribbon in video when their footage is running, and in the comments section below. And all of them deserve a subscription. They sure have mine. So, with all that out of the way, let's get to it. Alien Breed 2 The Horror Continues is appropriately named as it does. I mean, horror, it continues. Or as Master Yoda would have said,
the horror is strong in this one.
Oh my god, that was bad. Anyway, the game is way too tough for my liking and I just get frustrated rather than have fun when playing it. But judging by the Lemon Amiga score, my opinion seems to be an isolated one. Although the graphics were improved and the game uses newer, smoother scrolling engine, Alien Breed 2 is not fun. But I suppose it depends how much a player hates him or herself. Interestingly enough, the same engine was later on used by Team 17 to release their best platformer, Super Frog, which while representing totally different genre, was a much more enjoyable game. Amber Moon is a successor to Amber Star, a second title in unfinished trilogy of Talion's games. It's a role-playing game that plays in two perspectives. Top-down for generic buildings and overworld traversal, and 3D for dungeons, cities and special buildings. The game world is huge and full of many interesting and beautifully crafted, detailed locations, some even from previous Talion's games. Unlike many of the games of the time, Amber Moon can easily take over 100 hours to complete. While this is definitely a good thing, it's also a reason why it came on 9 floppies, and was a disk-swapping nightmare for those that were not lucky enough to own a hard drive. Interesting novelty was a height of first-person perspective viewpoint that depended entirely on the height of a character that was active at the time. While Amber Moon did not age great, especially in terms of scrolling of 2D sections, it's probably one of, if not the best, RPG on the Amiga. The Ancient Art of War in the Skies is one of the most unusual games of 1993, and a sequel to The Ancient Art of War and The Ancient Art of War at Sea, which were never released on the Amiga. It's a mixer of strategy and arcade games. So, most of your time will be spent on a 2D map directing your squadrons to their targets, and when they reach those, the game will switch into arcade mode. And there are two of those. A dogfight, side view one, where you battle against enemy planes, and an overhead view where you drop bombs on marked bombing targets. It's a really fun and engaging title that's sadly borderline unplayable outside of emulation because of ungodly long load times. It is truly a test of patience for those who play it on a real Amiga. And for those who approach the game with just one floppy drive, I salute you, as you are the true alphas among the rest of us. On April 30th, 2022, one Sideshow Bob, whose name I have no doubt butchered beyond recognition, wrote this on Lemon Amiga game page about Arabian Nights. If there was ever a game that needed a graphic overhaul and rebalancing, this is it. It sits on the edge of greatness but doesn't quite make it. I'm not sure how old Sideshow Bob is, so I kinda just imagined him as Easy Pete from Fallout New Vegas. Sorry. On a side note, I'm not sure that Easy Pete sounded the way I did just there. Anyway, I couldn't have put it better myself. These two sentences summarize the game perfectly. It's a game that does everything well: graphics, sound, level design and gameplay, everything, but nothing exceptional. and while it's definitely one of the most unique and memorable platformers on the Amiga, it's short of those few last coats of polish for ascension to something bigger, better and more unforgettable. Personally, I always liked it and played it to death with a friend of mine as a kid, but it's a bit uneven title, sometimes more, sometimes less difficult, so approach it at your own accord. B-17 Flying Fortress is a combat flight simulator of a titular bomber and an amazing game on PC. That's totally unplayable on the Amiga on anything other than heavily upgraded system with at least 68030 or 040 CPU or via emulation. And yes, I know that it technically could run on even the lowly A500, but regardless if it's A500 or A1200, in my opinion the game is a punishment on those systems that should be issued as opposed to community service to people who commit minor crimes. That said, if you have a system that could run it fluidly, it's an excellent simulation and one of the best of the early 90s and tons of fun. I suppose its 230 pages strong manual is the best proof on in-depth quality of a simulation that it offers. But that's something that you can check for yourself. With what I'm about to say now, I'll make some enemies. I'm sure of it. Anyway, Body Blows came out in a time when everyone strived for a perfect Street Fighter 2 clone, and most failed miserably. Body Blows is not different, sadly. The sound and graphics are excellent and could have served as an amazing base for a great versus fighting game. Team 17, however, had other plans, and there's no reason to circle around it. When it comes to gameplay, they just phoned it in. It's uninspiring, samey all throughout, and the characters seem to have a very limited palette of special moves. It's an okay game for 15 minutes against a friend, but any more than that or against the CPU is just boring. Many of you will probably disagree, but I'm not dissing Team 17 here for the sake of it. I believe they were capable of much more and just didn't care enough to put the hours in. Brutal Sports Series Football is the first title in Brutal duology of sports games. It's a very speedball-esque take on American football, but played by 7-a-side teams and much more brutal, gory and at times even deadly. Today the game would have been rated mature, as not only it glorifies violence in sport, but also depicts it in a very bloody, gruesome way, often resulting in decapitations via use of various in-game weapons. Don't get me wrong, I loved it, and I played it with a buddy of mine nearly daily for a part of one summer in 1990s. It's just a game that hardly ever got mentioned when the subject of violence in games was raised back then, while titles like Mortal Kombat were on absolute forefront of discussion. Anyway, if you enjoy light and not too strict when it comes to rules sports games, you'll love it. Personally, I always liked that you could win the match by eliminating the opposing team rather than by scoring. I love post-apocalyptic games. Don't know why? Perhaps it's the romantic idea of surviving what should not be survivable against all odds? Or odd mixture of 50s aesthetic and sci-fi that Fallout games popularized in their view of catastrophe. It's hard to tell, but back when Burn Time was released, neither of the Fallout games were a reality yet. And I sort of missed Burn Time. I'm not sure if I intentionally skipped it or if I just couldn't get my hands on it, but I didn't play it back then. And it's a pity, cause it's a very unique strategy game with some RPG elements. It takes place at the end of civilization as we know it, and you're in charge of conquering remaining habitable areas and survival of your people. You have to secure sources of food and water and protect your settlements. And as an added bonus, Burn Time could also be played in multiplayer, which made it even better. Especially cause most of those older, unusual strategies stuck to a single player mode. In my not so humble opinion, Cannon Fodder is Sensible Software's best game ever. Even better than their series of soccer games and one of the best arcade titles of the 16-bit era. It's a top-down view shooter fully controlled via mouse. And I gotta say that it's perfect, ergonomic and easy to comprehend even for someone who's not familiar with games. Staple sensible graphics are a core of presentation here, with few pixels in size, perfectly animated soldiers that you lead and various numerous enemies that they face. The game, in essence, has you leading a unit of up to 5 soldiers against enemy forces in 24 different missions, divided into 72 smaller phases. They range in objectives like killing all enemy units or destroying all their buildings, which coincidentally are also where those enemies spawn. And at your disposal, aside from machine guns, you have grenades, rockets and in some missions vehicles of many kinds. It's one of most fun and easy to get into games on the Amiga, easily in my top 10 overall. Same as with Cannon Fodder, Chaos Engine, a creation by famous Bitmap Brothers, is one of the best games on the Amiga. It seems that 1993, as I predicted, is a year that spawned most memorable titles for the system. But we'll see if that's true as we go along with the video. Anyway, the game is beautiful, steampunkish shooter for 1 or 2 players. And if you have a chance, I recommend from the get-go to play it with a friend, as it's then when Chaos Engine really spreads its wings. Not to mention that it's quite difficult, so having someone other than the CPU to help you makes it more enjoyable. The game could be best described as Gauntlet on steroids, that's less samey and less closed off with more open areas and small puzzles. I suppose it was in direct competition with Alien Breed series of games, and as much as both of these did not age perfectly like Cannon Fodder did, and require a bit of patience to get into, I think Chaos Engine is better than its Alien counterpart. It's not a rule, but in this particular case, second outing of Chuck Rock 2 Son of Chuck, is a better game than its predecessor. The game takes place in unspecified prehistoric times, and it seems to base a lot of its design ideas on the Flintstones. Which is not a bad thing, as back in the day the Flintstones were a pretty decent kids show. Story-wise, Chuck from Yestergame has been kidnapped and it's up to his son now to save him. The graphics are top-notch and accompanied by large, well-animated sprites of various prehistoric creatures. The level design is quite unusual and not following any of the standard genre tropes. Sometimes you'll have to scale a dinosaur spanning multiple screens, other time you'll run around phone lines or jump off of lizard's tongue to avoid dangers or get over obstacles. It all fits nicely together and is complemented by an enjoyable and often filled with genuinely funny moments gameplay. Combat Air Patrol is a flight simulator that takes place during the First Gulf War, and you have two aircrafts to choose from, F-14 Tomcat and FA-18 Hornet, with first primarily focusing on escort and patrol missions and second on bombing runs. The game offers a very deep and comprehensive simulation that allows for missions to be run all throughout. Meaning before you even get to your objective you have to take off, fly to it, often refuel midair if necessary, and then after completing it, come back and land. The game ends either when Kuwait is liberated or Saddam Hussein neutralized. Interesting addition is strategic layer, where aside from flying the missions yourself, you can control groups of ground troops and plan mission routes. Additionally, and it's a huge plus, while Combat Air Patrol is in 3D, it doesn't run like a snail in Tar on A500. It's actually playable. I used to really like Cool Spot back in the early 90s. I wouldn't say that I thought of it as being cool, but the graphics were definitely pretty good, sounds were okay, and the gameplay seemed fun. And since it looked and played differently than your typical Amiga platformer, I always found it engrossing. Today, when I compare it to all the other ports, be it on PC or consoles, it's clear that Amiga was dealt the short end of the stick. The system was capable of much more, and yet none of the specialized chips were properly utilized, and as a result not only it looks a bit more bland than other versions, but also suffers from scrolling stutters. Looking at the Lemon Amiga score now, I think it's appropriate, but at the time it was, at least in my eyes, a novelty of a platformer. I didn't play Cyberpunks back in the day, so I approached it solely based on the Lemon Amiga score and reviews that I read. User comments on the site kept mentioning atrociously aggressive time limit, and I didn't think that it could have really been that terrible. And then I played it. And yep, I can confirm, it's pretty bad. That said, it doesn't discourage from playing, and it's a pretty decent take on the Alien Breed formula. Perhaps not as polished, but quite good for an afternoon or two. If you haven't had the chance to check it out, do so, it's not a bad one. Dangerous Streets is one of those games that looks very good on screenshots, and that's pretty much everything good that I have to say about it. It's one of the worst titles ever released on the Amiga, and a packing title to some Amiga 1200 packs, which was a travesty because it's what we would have called it now, a clickbait. The game may not be as bad as Pro Soccer 2150, but it's not far off and deserves a spot in this video as one of the worst games on the Amiga and in existence really. I'm sure that by watching the footage you think it's really bad too, but it's much worse than it looks even. It's the worst fighting game that I've ever played. Desert Strike Return to the Gulf is an isometric shoot-em-up taking place in fictional depiction of Gulf War-like setting. In-game you're in control of Apache helicopter with a tail of Comanche, which is an odd choice and something that escaped my understanding. Unless there were some underlying licensing reasons, but I have no way of knowing that now. In Desert Strike you will perform various missions ranging from destroying enemy installations to rescuing hostages, and have free weapons at your disposal to do so. Machine gun, Hydra, and even more powerful Hellfire missiles. And since all these and fuel are limited, you have to keep either finding containers with gas and weaponry, or come back to the beach drop-off point near start location from time to time if the mission length requires that. Funny enough, while Amiga version was not the first, being just a conversion from Sega Genesis, it is still considered an ultimate one. Diggers is a puzzle game where you're in control of a mining team of diggers from one of 4 races that have to excavate for treasures that can be sold later on stock exchange. Interestingly enough, that exchange always purchases up to 3 kinds of precious gems, and there are 4 in the game, meaning that you have to visit quite often to make sure to maximize your profit. The diggers are controlled similarly to lemmings, so you issue commands to them and then they perform them if it's possible. From time to time, however, they wander off on their own accord, which can have both positive and negative consequences. Each of the 34 levels is played until a certain monetary score is reached, and you always play against a CPU-controlled opponent. so you have to split your time between digging and fighting off opposing diggers. It's an interesting title, even if a bit repetitive, but definitely worth checking out. Demo's Quest is an arcade puzzler very similar to Chip's Challenge. But while it's clearly inspired by it, I'd say that Demo's Quest is good enough to stand on its own. The graphics are pretty good, perhaps not anything that stood above the average for the Amiga, but they don't distract from the experience and the puzzling is awesome. The goal of each level is pretty simple, to collect all the candies and get to the exit. But since many of the levels require solving variously themed puzzles and opening differently colored doors in correct order, Demo's Quest is surprisingly addictive and at times even challenging, despite even the cute and colorful graphics. Disposable Hero is one of the most well-known shoot-em-ups on the Amiga, also one with some of the best graphics on the system for the genre. Unfortunately, it's a game that's more for either hardcore shooter fans or people with compulsively good memory. Why, you may wonder? Well, the game is incredibly difficult, borderline disturbingly so. I'm sure the video is giving that statement justice. That said, there are some other minor issues too, like a lack of any visual indication on most enemies that they are being hit. Which means that if someone's unfamiliar with the title, they will end up shooting at everything all around, hoping that it may be a potential target. Is Disposable Hero a bad game? No, it's not. But it's one that should be approached carefully. While Dune 2 The Battle for Arrakis may have not been the very first RTS, it's the first modern RTS, and a title that defined most of the staple genre characteristics that we know and see in games even today. Things like gathering and processing of resources, and then use of those resources to build structures and train units. Point-and-click commanding of armies, and the need of protecting gatherers as they crucial for progress while being very fragile. And last but not least, the Circle of Power, meaning that each unit had a weakness that other unit could exploit. So knowledge of your army's composition was a key. It's a great and enjoyable title that did not age well, sadly. Some design choices are outdated by now, for instance the fact that you couldn't control more than one unit at a time. Nonetheless, Dune is one of the most important games in history. I have no doubt about that. In History of Amiga Gaming video for the year 1991 we spoke about arcade Formula 1 racer called Vroom. F1 is Vroom licensed to Domark with a small but very significant difference. So, everything that was said about that title applies here too, but F1 can actually be enjoyed in couch multiplayer in split-screen mode. Was that enough to warrant a new title? Perhaps not, and the version upgrade to let's say 1.5 would be enough, but I suppose something was more at play here. Still, the split screen is fun if you have someone to race against, even if a bit choppier than playing it alone. I always liked Vroom, and I like F1 too. It's not the best racer on the Amiga, but definitely an enjoyable one. F-17 Challenge is an interesting arcade racer. It's interesting because it's a touch away from being great and just falls short of reaching that mark because of some small but overall quite significant issues. But we'll get back to that in a little while. The game has very nice and fluidly animated graphics with pretty decent sprite scaling and quite good car models. The sounds are okay, but nothing that would have lifted it above racing average. Where it's disappointing though is how all tracks seem identical and you just can't tell one from another. That said, the absolute biggest offender here is something entirely different. The opposing cars, that seem to be doing nothing else but constantly trying to get in your way, like literally aiming to do so, and that's just a bad game design. Because even if it's an arcade racer, in real life that would have been extremely risky and life-threatening behavior. Despite all I said, I like F-17. I do, but only for a race or two at a time. And we've finally arrived at the game that is probably my most favorite out of all games of 16-bit era, and also one I have most beef with, Frontier Elite 2. Which is painful because it's a love-hate relationship. On one hand we've got a universe worth of gameplay, thousands upon thousands of star systems, each with different planetary bodies, numerous bases on both planets and around them in form of space stations, dozens of differently spec'd ships with hundreds of upgrades and commodities to trade, factions, missions, ranks, and a rumor of a hostile alien race. In an open-ended gameplay where you have no real hard-coded and game-ending objective and can just carry on living your spaceman life indefinitely. Be it as a pirate, trader, working for the army or government, or just as an explorer of the unknown, going where no man has gone before. And all that in a true 3D graphics that's perhaps nothing to write home about now, but in the early 90s on the Amiga was stunning. It's a space lover's wet dream. And it was. It was all just a dream. Because while I've sunk probably close to a couple of thousands of hours in Frontier, it was an absolute nightmare to play on a basic A500. A1200, preferably with some fast RAM, was required for comfortable play, but it wasn't in the cards for me, and I've massacred a couple of mice playing it on my old system. I absolutely hated the way I had to engage it, but just couldn't put it away. When I moved to PC a few years later, I revisited Frontier for another few hundred hours and it was as good, just much faster. Despite my genuine love for the game, it's a tough one to recommend, as not everyone likes games with no set task, where you can just live in the futuristic space. I believe that Gearworks is one of the most underrated Amiga puzzle games, probably because it looks and sounds well below average for 1993. And since it doesn't look very entertaining, judging by the screens only, audiences in the 90s could have easily disregarded it in favor of more colorful, more easily distinguishable from others' title. It's a mistake, though, as Gearworks is actually a pretty good game and a very enjoyable puzzler. Sure, it may not be the most difficult one, at least initially, and quite repeatable, but I always thought of it more as a relaxed puzzler, that you can just get into, go through each level letting your mind wander, rather than flexing all your brain cells all throughout. Genesia is often overlooked because it tends to be misunderstood by players of Populous and Powermonger alike. Genesia is not an RTS at all, so similarities to those games end on the graphics. It's a very difficult to categorize title, and I'd say that it's a mixture of settlers, populars, and civilization. Your ultimate goal is finding and securing 7 mystical jewels, while in the same time growing, strengthening and securing your kingdom. While Genesia is turn-based, the turns themselves have a timer, so you can't just leave the game and go about your day without saving first, as by the time you come back it may very well be over. The game is divided into 4 seasons and each offers different challenges and benefits. After building a workshop, you'll get access to research tree that with an inventor assigned to it will allow for technological progress. It's an amazing, even if largely ignored game, and one worth checking out. If I wouldn't know any better and didn't prepare the game list ahead of the time, I would have said that this video is mainly about the underrated and overlooked games. It's not, but Globdule, that you see on the screen, no doubt is. It's a very unique and quite fun mechanically platformer by Psygnosis, where you're in control of Purple Blob. Or is it a pink slime? I'm a man, I don't know many colors, you'll have to forgive me. The gimmick is that it's not your typical run in one direction platformer, but one that levels expand in all directions and you're not really jumping on the platforms, but rather at them, cause you can stick to any of their surfaces. Regardless on which side, you'll be at the wall or a ceiling as often as you're on the ground. It's a fun game, even if a bit too experimental for some to stomach. The goal by Dino Dino of Kickoff fame divided Kickoff fans. Some said it was more like Sensible Soccer than Kickoff, but broken Sensible Soccer at that. Which, I can't agree with, as I know what it is and why it is the way it is, but in the same time I dislike it because it's just not my cup of tea. Anyway, the thing with Goal is that it did not want to be an arcade footy at all, but a simulation, which for all intents and purposes is very good target to aim for, but difficult to achieve on simple systems of yesteryear. Not impossible, but definitely not easy. So the game simulates everything: acceleration and deceleration, tackling, passing and even shooting. Meaning to be at the very least so-so at it, not to mention decent or good, you have to put in real life hours and practice, and practice. Cause as the saying goes, apparently it makes perfect. And honestly, not many people were keen on doing so. Goblins 3 is arguably the best out of all Goblins point-and-click adventure games. Same as previous titles, most puzzles are not necessarily based on logic or expectations that you would have for real-life occurrences, but it's not important as fun comes from exploration of different interactions between characters and objects and an overarching story that is sort of a continuation of the one from Goblins 2. It's obviously full of quirky and often unrealistic humor, an absolute joy to behold if you're someone that can forgive a very painful disc swapping routine. Gunship 2000 is bar none the best combat helicopter simulator on the Amiga. As with most microprocessor simulations, you can choose between flying a single mission or a campaign. The latter composed out of chains of singular missions with primary and secondary objectives assigned randomly in a tug-of-war system, meaning that the better you do, the more offensive the missions will be, and the worse you play, the more you will be on a defense. Initially you can choose between 5 different copters, but with promotions it can be expanded up to 7, with the most powerful 2 being added to the roster last. With a promotion to second lieutenant, you'll be given ability to control wingmen, arm their copters and either keep them at your side or send them off to complete other tasks like secondary objectives. Gunship is a very good, if a bit difficult game, mixing simulation with arcade bits in more or less 85 to 15% ratio. And yep, there's no math to support this claim, it's all me. Heartlight is a game that I think most people never heard of. On one hand, it only ever came out in Polish, which theoretically should limit its potential reach. On the other, there is literally nothing to read in it, so aside from starting credits and loading screen, it's hardly noticeable and doesn't get in the way of playing. It's my most favorite Boulder Dash-esque game on the Amiga. Built-in levels are a bit more strategic and difficult than dashes are, so at times Heartlight requires quite a bit of try and error to work everything out. It's genuinely a very good and most importantly fun game, and the fact that it has a text file based level editor is just a cherry on a pie of this little gem. The only real downside to it are the controls that feel a bit too sensitive, but that could probably be software limited if played under emulation. Hired Guns is a role-playing / dungeon crawling game set in a future of 2712, where you control 4 mercenaries out of pool of available 12. All of them have their own viewpoints and can either be controlled by you or by up to 4 other players all at once on a single Amiga. And your mission is to destroy all illegally bioengineered organisms on the aptly named planet Graveyard. You can do so by finding and using 4 fusion power core rings in the field core generators. The game is played in full 3D and enemies have complete freedom of movement, meaning if they want to, they can chase your team throughout the game, even changing floor levels as you do. Admittedly, I haven't played Hired Guns as much as I should, and that's on me, but what I did so and read in others' reviews confirms its near cult classic status, and it's definitely a title worth trying by all fans of dungeon crawling RPGs. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is what third movie in the Indy trilogy should have been, but instead we've got Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which was a bit of a letdown. Still, Fate of Atlantis is arguably the most ambitious and biggest in scope out of all LucasArts adventure games that came out on the Amiga. While the puzzles are quite tough in this one, they are not illogical as in many other point-and-click games, so you should never be left in a situation where you have to get into trial and error frenzy. The game uses 32 colors only, but since it's not a mindless port from 256 color PC, it looks amazing and you can hardly tell that it's not as beautiful as PC's counterparties. A very unique at the time feature was the ability to complete the game in one of 3 different ways, aka paths that you will follow. So, you can choose the team path, the wits path, and the fists path. First will allow Indy to take Sophia Hapgood with him on the adventure, and she will provide support all throughout. Second, adds more puzzles and always presents more complex and challenging versions of them. And finally, the fists path focuses on action sequences and fist fighting, which in itself is completely optional in the first 2 modes. On top of that, there are also 3 entirely different endings, a good one and 2 bad ones, so Fate of Atlantis, unlike most adventure games, offers a lot of replayability. If there is one downside I could think of, it's the fact that Indy came on 11 floppies, so if you didn't have a hard drive, disc juggling was a sad and gruesome reality while playing. But let me be clear here, the game is so good that it's worth the sacrifice, and you won't hear me say that often. Ishar 2 Messengers of Doom is a first-person perspective role-playing game released in 1993 on the Amiga and the second title in Silmarill's Ishar trilogy. Ishar 2 takes place on series of islands, each offering different landscape and scenery, which was a fresh approach as compared to previous titles' Forest and Dungeons. Your task is to defeat the evil sorcerer Shandar, and you can do it either with a group of new adventurers or with a team imported from the first game. Ishar offers a working day-night cycle with all that it entails, meaning shops won't be open during the nighttime, and opposed to that, nightclub will not be accessible during the daylight, for instance. Ishar 2 features a bank building that allows players to store their valuables, which was a welcome addition, and fixed the issue of losing gold upon saving, a sort of design problem with the first game. Even though Ishar 2 games never gained as huge following as Dungeon Master or Eye of the Beholder series did, they were universally loved by players, and the second outing is generally considered to be the best out of all 3. If you liked Wings of Fury, you'll like Jetstrike. It's a more varied, bigger and in my opinion better game. Sure, the controls are not as intuitive and not the easiest at start, but when you get used to them, they feel very natural. That said, it has to be mentioned here that Jetstrike is near unplayable with crappy joysticks, as the plane just reacts wonky when they are used. It's hard to explain, but very easy to understand when compared swapping between good and cheap joystick. The game offers dozens upon dozens of various real-life planes from different eras, copters and other not necessarily real-life flying vehicles and creatures, and a campaign composed out of varied missions. There are quite a lot of weapons to choose from too, and in general the game plays like a charm if you pass that initial high entry threshold. Which is also a reason why Jetstrike in eyes of many gamers is disregarded as unplayable, because it requires that time investment that not many are keen on giving. Lemmings to the Tribes was more differently themed worlds, more abilities that could be given to those tiny creatures, more levels that were also more difficult than in original. And while it was the Lemmings game I spent most time with, especially because of a very fun practice mode, it's also one that I couldn't get as far as in the others. The amount of different and not always easily applicable abilities just made the game a bit too convoluted and unnecessarily challenging. Don't get me wrong, I don't mind the challenge, but as long as all the mechanics are easily understandable and the difficulty progress is steady and not jumpy between the consecutive levels. But perhaps it's just me failing as a gamer and everyone else fared in Lemmings 2 much farther and much easier. Let me know in the comments below. Lionheart is a technical achievement. It's a title that proved that even the most basic A500 with 1 MB of RAM in hands of talented and dedicated people can offer games that can compete graphically with Sega Genesis and SNES. I mean, just look at the parallax scrolling in the background. It's a beauty. All the sprites for your character and enemies and all the world details are incredible too. Sounds and level design are nothing to scoff either. And it's all good and dandy and it's a pretty big but for an action platformer, but the controls leave a bit to be desired. Not all moves are easy to pull off, and often impossible to repeat in quick succession, requiring the move animation to fully complete, even if it has no movement in the last few frames. It's something that you can definitely get used to, but in a platformer it's definitely not something you expect to need to. Lionheart uses a very smart and genre-defining approach to difficulty level choice though. The harder levels not only feature more challenging enemies, but also differently designed environments, and some of the levels are even expanded, resulting in a longer game. Lionheart, despite its small, single shortcoming, is one of the best and most impressive platformers on the Amiga, and one that all fans of the system or a genre should have in their collections. The Lost Vikings is an interesting title. It's a mixture of sorts between a classic platformer and a puzzle game. The main trio of characters all have their unique skills and usage scenarios, and it's your job to lead them to each level's end by utilizing those skills to the best of your abilities. Coincidentally, they also pretty much sum up a classic golden trio of MMORPG parties. Obviously, The Lost Vikings is not a MMORPG, but to be quite honest, I'm already way in too deep in this thought process to now stop it. Henceforth, why I'm going to follow this odd path to its very end. So the red-haired skinny guy can run, jump and headbutt walls when sped up enough. It's obvious that he's our typical dexterity-based rogue/scout quick-acting character. Then there's the stocky tank with a shield. That might not seem like much, but it can be used twofold, as shield god's intended for personal and party protection, and also as a sort of parachute to safely glide down from ever-present heights. Finally, the muscled mustachio has a sword and a bow, representing DPS warrior class like a boss, by spreading death and destruction left and right. The fact that he can activate faraway switches with targeted arrow shots is just an added bonus. The main quest of our three heroes, as in many Tales of Yore, is simple: to come back home to their loved ones. That's definitely not going to be easy, and with each and every encounter, they will face more overwhelming odds and tougher puzzles to solve. Anyway, The Lost Vikings is a fun game. If you never played it, I'm sure you'll love it, and if you know it, then you probably do already. Minoriness is a difficult game to categorize. I'm not sure I know how, but if I was to entertain a guess, I'd say it's probably a multiplayer Pac-Man mixed with a game show and a top-down puzzle shooter. I know, sounds insane. And since you're watching the game, you know that it looks insane too. But it plays like a charm. I may not have anyone here to play it with, but I have no doubt that in multiplayer it would have been even better. Still, I gotta say that it's super fun. Numerous upgrades, playwall position switches, teleports and other pickups all add to the immersion and frantic gameplay. The in-between level hosts highlight the game show atmosphere with their funny and odd commentary. It's one of those games that I did not have back in the day and just discovered while working on this video, but I have to admit that it's a true gem, and I will be definitely revisiting it in the future. Micro Machines proved that the game does not need groundbreaking graphics or orchestral soundtrack to be amazing. In the end, it's gameplay that's all that matters, and Micro Machines has it in heaps. While as a single-player title, it's not great and just your run-of-the-mill top-down view racer, in multiplayer, against a friend, it's amazing. Racing those tiny toy vehicles on kitchen counters, pool tables, sandboxes and many more locations around the house is hella fun. And the fact that each car handles differently and every track is a unique location extends the life of this racer considerably. Micro Machines may not be as good as the second game that never came out on the Amiga, but it's the best we've got, and as that, it's a definite recommendation. Nighthawk F-117A Stealth Fighter 2.0 is widely considered Microprose's best fighter simulation on the Amiga and one of the best on the system out of all simulations overall. The game mission takes place in Cuba and Persian Gulf, and since F-117A is a stealth fighter, majority of these take part during nighttime, flying low altitude, avoiding the radar detection. As with most Microprose combat simulations, all missions have both primary and secondary objectives, earlier required to complete the missions, later rewarding additional points. Interestingly enough, this game, unlike F19, was actually conceived after full specs of the craft became public, so it's more realistic. In fact, it offers a choice of real F117 or microprocess implementation that took more free and based on previous title approach to the airplane's base stats. One Step Beyond is a sequel to The Pushover, and that's a spoiler if there ever was one. Anyway, all the aspects of the presentation are top-notch and the game features pretty cool animated intro, same as its predecessor did. In fact, the game overall has cartoon-like quality to it. Gameplay is based around idea of closing platforms, main character Colin is jumping on. Challenge comes from the fact that he has to end up on a very specific one, and the ones in between first and last often have different qualities assigned to them, like for instance propelling him automatically in a certain direction or closing other platforms around them. It's a really fun game worth playing and in my opinion one of the best puzzlers on the Amiga. I'm not sure if it's still on as I long stopped watching TV, but back in the early 2000s there was a show called Pimp My Ride. Overkill is just that, pimped up 1981's Defender, quite literally. Not much has been added or changed, apart from presentation getting a complete and long-deserved rework. The game looks and sounds great, sure, but did we really need in 1993 a game that was de facto designed in 1981? And even more so, one that required AGA chipset that owners of were a very small subset of all Amiga gamers? On top of that, Overkill shares another of Defender's qualities, difficulty level. That's obviously through the roof. Perhaps not in the first couple of levels, but it ramps up quite quickly. It's not everyone's cup of tea, that's for sure, but it's not a bad game, it just seems to be out of its time. The Patrician was actually released under its original name Der Patrizier in 1992, but since I sadly don't speak German, I will be talking about the international 1993 release here. Which, you know, is another proof that in the 16-bit era German developers were absolute grandmasters of trading and management games. Patrician is no different. It's incredibly deep and well-executed trading game that simulates very complex and dynamic economy, where nearly everything from supply and demand to investments and actions of all players influence it in one way or another. While your ultimate goal is to become the leader of so-called Hanseatic League, I prefer playing Patrician as an open-ended title where you grow your empire and amass a wealth. And to do so you have a multitude of available endeavors. You'll obviously be trading using both trading offices and ships, you'll build public works, private houses, industries and can even pursue a political career. Interaction with pirates and burglars is also not something out of your sphere of interests. I wouldn't say that The Patrician was ahead of its time, but it was definitely a representative of an absolute best the times could offer in its genre and a title that deservedly so gained huge popularity. When Perihelion: The Prophecy came out, I was 12 or perhaps 13. While not a kid anymore and already heavily invested into RPGs, I wasn't prepared for Perihelion, and even though I tried approaching it numerous times, I always somehow end up bouncing off of it and landing with another game in my disk drive. Perhaps it was the initial difficulty, or the brown-greyish tones of everything, or simply me not being mature enough to fully encompass and understand what I had been given a chance to experience. And even though now, dark, gritty and cyberpunkish aesthetics of Perihelion would be my dream world to visit in a game, I never completed it. And based on the amount of games that I'm interested in that are released yearly, chances are I never will. And that's one of the biggest failures of my personal gaming history. Since I've spent long enough on myself, let's talk a little about Perihelion itself. You're in charge of 6 characters whose races are odd and very intimate amalgamations of human and different animal and mechanical entities. And you have to save the realm that you live in from an evil being that's slowly materializing into your dimension and is foretold to bring end to it. The game is viewed from the first-person perspective and the battle sequences are top-down with a turn-based combat. Quite unique, at least for the time, was the skill leveling system that raised those most used faster than the others. It's one of those games that I've never seen a single negative review for, and that's definitely something worth keeping in mind. Today we have Sega's Football Manager, a game that has long lost all of its serious competitors. And no wonder, it's such a deep and well-crafted title that even trying to steal a piece of its pie of fanbase seems impossible. Rumor has it that it's so accurate that some managers use it as a database rather than a game. But that may very well be just a modern urban legend, I have no way of confirming or denying that. One way or another, back then we had many more choices and football management games were plenty. Premier Manager 2 is one of those titles and a good one at that. Perhaps not one of my favorites, but one that I enjoyed from time to time. And as in most in a genre, you can not only manage your team starting at the conference all the way to the Premiership, but also your club's finances, sponsorships, ticket sales and stadium upgrades. Not to mention all the transfers and staff hiring. So if you're a football management fan and are currently looking for a good one on the Amiga, there's only a couple other games that could be called as good or better. So if you settle on Premier Manager 2, you'll have a great time. While Project X Special Edition is most definitely not an easy game, in fact it's very challenging, but it is still nowhere near as difficult as the regular version was. It's a year later re-release modified to be easier and much more digestible by general populace. And it is. It is easier and better playing outing with tons of various fixes, removed broken level and overall much more enjoyable gameplay loop. All that said, however, it is also still way too difficult for me to make any reasonable progress in. But I was never any good at horizontally scrolling shooters, so Project X Special Edition is just not an exception here. The presentation is really good, graphics are crisp and colorful, and sounds along with perhaps a bit annoying and repeating himself commentator are pretty decent too. So if you're in the market for a shoot 'em up on the Amiga and don't mind the challenge, this game may very well be what you're looking for. While Quack is often called bubble-like game, I'd say that it stands on its own feet. It's a single-screen arcade puzzle platformer and it's surprisingly addictive. The goal of the game is simple, to progress through all the levels collecting gold and silver keys that open the doors to the next stages. There are also gems and fruit, but these are all collected for points only, and are not crucial for progression. But since the game is score-based, then if you're competing against someone, it's the score that counts. Anyway, Quack is chock full of various enemies and you can defeat them by throwing eggs that work as projectiles and are accumulated throughout the game. And for the longest time, I didn't like the game cause I've never pressed fire. Yep, I'm definitely not the sharpest tool. So, since I couldn't beat one of the first few levels, repeating it time after time, I got extremely frustrated and wanted to give up completely, not understanding what others saw in it. And as I was putting the joystick away, I accidentally pressed fire. From that moment, my opinion about Quack and how it played changed 180 degrees. So, if there's a lesson to learn here, it's don't be stupid, don't be me, press your fire. Realms of Arcania Blade of Destiny is a full-fledged role-playing and also a first title in Realms of Arcania trilogy based on German pen and paper RPG system, the Dark Eye. And by full-fledged I meant that it's not just a combat-oriented dungeon crawler as many games of the yesteryear were, but a very deep and engaging experience, where you have to keep track of many things throughout the game, like separate thirst and hunger for all 6 of your adventurers. You can also split your group into smaller teams and control them separately if necessary, which often proves quite useful. It's a game that was in fact ahead of its time, perhaps not by much, but was nonetheless. Blade of Destiny is played in a typical for the genre first-person view when traversing, and switches into top-down 2D grid-based tactical display for combat encounters, which are surprisingly deep actually, and really fun even if a bit clunky to control. If you enjoy good, big and time-consuming RPGs with huge world and hundreds upon hundreds of items, Blade of Destiny is definitely a game for you. Before Team 17's Worms, we had Scorched Tanks, and while Scorched Tanks may not look as good or be as accessible, it's an amazing title and the one I probably spent more time playing than Worms while I still had an Amiga, simply because it came out earlier. Now as I said that, I see that it's a bit misleading as I have an Amiga even today, but for a good 20 years I didn't. Anyway, Scorched Tanks is really well designed and a blast to play, especially with up to 3 friends on a single system. The levels are randomly generated and the game offers a selection of over 70 weapons to choose from, and dozens of different kinds of shields. Weapons can range from simple explosives of various power, through homing and under-the-earth surface tracing ones to even scattering bombs and nukes. And there are also special ones that can either provide protective walls for you, or bury your opponent under a huge pile of dirt. Shields are quite ingenious too, cause they're not only lowering the damage you receive but can have other special effects, like bouncing off enemy projectiles from their surface, or be magnetic, repelling metal shots directed your way, among many others. Scorched Tanks is a game that would never win any awards for graphics or sound, as these were serviceable at best, even if at 64 colors on 1MB chip machines. But in terms of gameplay, it's one of the most memorable experiences on the Amiga. Second Samurai on the Amiga seems to be universally loved. Some even call it the best action platformer on the system. I wouldn't go as far, but I have to admit that it's pretty good. There are a few changes to what we had in First Samurai though. For starters, you can play the game in 2-player mode, and believe me, if you got someone to play it with, it's so much fun. Not that it's not alone, just not as much. Then there's also 3 eras or teams that the game takes place in. a prehistoric one, a feudal Japan, so same as in the first title, and futuristic one. While the controls are considerably improved and much more user-friendly than in previous game, there is still no support for 2-button joysticks, which is a shame. Because as much as I was used to it then, it annoys me incredibly now that I have to press up to jump. But I suppose that's something I could point out in like 95% of cases when it came to Amiga's joystick-controlled games. Anyway, the graphics are really nice and a definite step up from the first title. Sounds are pretty good too, perhaps nothing out of ordinary, but decent for the genre. So to summarize, if you enjoy action platformers or liked First Samurai, you're in for a treat and you definitely will not be disappointed. At the first glance, Seek and Destroy may seem difficult, especially a few levels in, as it's very hectic and a lot can happen on a screen at once. But if you give it time and familiarize yourself with both controls and weapons, you'll learn how to appreciate it. I'm not gonna lie, the footage that you're watching is me cheating by using unlimited ammo trainer, meaning all my weapons are fully loaded at all times, and sure, that's not how you're supposed to play it, but for the presentation purposes it's good enough. It's probably also quite obvious by now that Seek and Destroy is multi-way scrolling arcade shooter. And you know what? It's actually pretty fun and addictive. I can't tell why, but that chaotic destruction and copter chases are pretty enjoyable. While the mission objectives in theory are quite varied, I've noticed that most of the time if you just go to your target mark and kill everything there, you'll complete the mission. So take it as you want to, but I suppose for what it is, so a fast arcade shooter, it's irrelevant what those imaginary objectives really are. Settlers is probably one of the most innovative titles of the whole 16-bit era and easily one of top 10 games on the Amiga. When it came out, there was literally nothing else like it. To simplify, it's a real-time kingdom builder with strategy and management elements. And as we all very well know by now, the best management games came from Germany. And Settlers is no different, as it was made by the now veterans of the industry, Blue Byte. Settlers was monumentally different than anything else that came before. The attention to detail was uncanny and unprecedented. Seeing all those tiny, incredibly animated workers prepare the land for building, then carry all the required materials to the building site, and finally erect them plank by plank, brick by brick, was just hypnotizing. And if that wasn't enough, when the building was finally complete and a worker was assigned to it, he actually did also work there. For instance, a farmer went around his farm planting crops, then they grew over time, and when they were ready to harvest, he would mow them and then carry to the mill, where another worker would grind them. Not to mention that underneath this wonderful world was very deep and complex system of needs, where supply and demand were crucial and all the available resources had to be carefully managed. To my young mind, Settlers was just enchanting and I couldn't get enough of it. Most survival/settlement building games of today still base most of their mechanics on Settlers. The best thing about it, however, was a 2-player split-screen mode where you could compete against a friend on a single machine with 2 mice connected to it at the same time. And it's something that even today's PCs can't pull off. SimLife is well, I can't really circle around it in any way, a life simulator. You're in charge of a whole planet and the point of the game, although come to think of it, I'm not sure I should be calling it a game really. Anyway, the point is to create a self-sustaining and healthy ecosystem. What's interesting about it though is you can alter genetics of both plants and animals, simulating and controlling the evolution of all species, and making sure that they and their genetic offspring would survive in Earth's environment. On the flip side, you can also change the environmental specifics and underlying physics of the planet and universe it's into, so the possibilities here are near endless. But it's only for those who find tinkering with sliders and numbers and watching numerous charts enjoyable. Others will find it boring or even worse, not playable at all, and will give up within minutes of launching SimLife. And that's why I don't think that it's a game. It's probably best described as graphically rich simulation software for the ecologically conscious to immerse themselves in. Simon the Sorcerer is a humorous point-and-click game that's universally considered as one of the best adventures on the Amiga. The inspiration by the Discworld novels is quite obvious, and there are also parodies of other famous books within the title, like Lord of the Rings and Jack and the Beanstalk, to name a few. Story-wise, you're, surprise surprise, Simon, a teenage boy living in our world, who shortly after his birthday is transported into a parallel universe of magic on a mission to save the wizard Calypso and defeat the evil sorcerer Sordid. The game engine used by the Simon the Sorcerer is similar to the SCUM engine used in LucasArts games, with word commands and inventory at the bottom of the screen and game window above. Presentation-wise, Simon is one of the best looking 2D games on the system. Sadly, the sound effects, speech and animated intro are completely absent on the floppies and can only be found in the CD32 version. It doesn't change the fact that it's one of the most fun and enjoyable adventure games not only on the Amiga, but of the whole 16-bit era. While I always considered its successor a much better game, Skid Marks is pretty good on its own too. It's an isometric view racing game for 1 to 4 players. The game offers a selection of 4 cars, but to be able to have them all on the screen at once, you need a system with at least 2.5 MB of RAM. With smaller configurations, less different cars can be displayed in the same time. For 1 MB systems, for instance, all cars need to be identical. Which is a bit disappointing, but I suppose there had to be some hardware limitations that required the additional memory to load all the assets. Or perhaps there was no compression routines. It's hard to tell being no more than a player, but these are my best guesses. Anyway, all 6 tracks are circuits, with no sprint races available, but they're quite fun to race on and reward mastering drifting. Graphically the game looks okay, some would probably swear that it was amazing, but it never struck me as such, and it definitely looked better 2 years later in the form of Super Skid Marks. Soccer Kid is a platformer, but with a unique mechanic that you're a soccer player, footballer, and you have your football with you. And it is in fact your main means of platforming. You can use it to fight off enemies, you can use it to propel yourself upwards much higher than you could jump otherwise. And last but definitely not least, you can use it to just collect items all around the levels. And you know what? All those mechanics actually work pretty well and the game is very enjoyable just to kick off to. Graphics, as you can see, are really good. All sprites are big and nicely animated, and it runs butter smooth. Sounds and music are also decent and fit the fast-paced platformer theme quite nicely. My favorite, though quite passive for the player part of the game, is the story. It's so incredibly stupid that it's leaning towards being good. So, on one of those beautiful days, aliens decided to steal the biggest of Earth's treasures, Football World Cup Cup. But while doing so, it got hit by a falling meteor or something along those lines and split into 5 pieces falling to Earth, each piece in a different place. And somehow our protagonist not only know about it, but also decides to go on a quest of recovering all of them from around the world. All by himself, having just a football as his only means of traversal. It's just silly. Space Hulk is a first-person squad-based real-time tactical strategy. Wow, that's a mouthful. It's based upon 1989's board game of the same title and set in a fictional Warhammer 40,000 universe. You're in charge of genetically enhanced space marines and you battle your way through hordes of deadly aliens aboard huge derelicts known as Space Hulks. You can command your entire squad using an overhead maps or each marine individually via first-person view interface. The stark contrast between heavy, armed and slowly moving marines and fast and deadly aliens results in a very horror-like atmosphere full of jump scares. Each mission starts with your marines in one of 2 start points while the enemies spawn continuously from pre-established numerous entry points. Since having to manage all those marines at once is a lot, some of the weapons, Stormbolters in this particular case, offer an automatic overwatch. So marines armed with those would assume automatic overwatch shooting at enemies that enter their paths. You can also temporarily freeze time to issue commands during those high-stakes battles, but the time of that pause is very limited and to replenish it you have to stay appropriately long in real-time mode. Stardust and its polished and rebalanced sequel Super Stardust, released a year later, are the best and most modern versions of asteroids that any of the systems of the 16-bit era had. It's an asteroids clone with better graphics and sound and added multiple kinds of weapons, numerous types of enemies, and asteroid fields tunnel traversal in between the stages. It's a pretty fun title, but so difficult that it's near impossible to enjoy. Unless you're a super gamer, which I'm not, hence why we're not watching me play. Or dying, as that's what I would have been doing most of the time. The game's most memorable characteristic, however, was the incredible for the time graphics. That proved that while people in charge of Commodore might have been mismanaging the company, the Amiga in the right hands was still a very powerful and capable system. It wasn't enough, however, to encourage developers slowly leaving the AMI for PC to stay, especially that it didn't seem back then that anything would be changing for the better. To summarize, Stardust is a decidefully beautiful game that is devilishly tough and quite fun to play. Super Frog is my most favorite platformer on the Amiga. I'm sure it's not a surprise to those who'd seen my review of it or my older top 10 Amiga platformers video. But yeah, I love it. It does a lot well, but before I get into that, I'll tell you what it doesn't. Well, the intro, while being beautifully animated, tells a story that's just 90s stupid. Sure, story is not important in a platformer. I mean, look at Super Mario, there's hardly any background there other than the need to save Princess Peach, and it's a brilliant title. Team 17 actually thought of Super Frog's motivation and background, but it's incredibly silly, so I'm not even going to give it Soccer Kids treatment and brief it. And that's pretty much it, the rest will be superlatives only. The game is really huge. There are 24 regular levels divided into 6 differently themed worlds, 2 special horizontally scrolling shoot-em-up sections, and a final boss fight against the antagonist of the game, the Evil Witch. The levels scroll in all 8 directions and often backtracking is required to collect plenty enough coins to open the level's ending door. Super Frog is just chock full of hidden areas and coin caches. In virtually every single level there are numerous hidden passages that you have to hunt down and uncover, and coins stuck in least expected places, like unusual cloud formations, oddly placed mushrooms or paintings. The enemies are aplenty and different in each world, divided into those that can be defeated by either jumping on them Mario style or with the use of your collectible yo-yo-like green projectile, and those that cannot and simply have to be avoided. All of these often have their own patterns of movement and attack or other underlying mechanics. And finally, Super Frog is, well, super, but only because it can use many of the spread across all levels pickups. Some of them are simple, like speed up or speed downs or energy refill, but the most important are a green projectile, wings and invincibility in the form of invisibility. Whatever you do, however, whichever powers you possess, remember that spikes always equal instant death. Super Frog is the bomb, and one of the best games on the system. Back in the day I loved Syndicate. Its cyberpunkish futuristic setting coupled with simple strategy layer and mixed with action-packed squad-based arcade shooting was what I was definitely into. The future is dark and the world is run by corporations. You work for one of these and have to lead the team of cybernetically modified and heavily armed agents on series of missions to take control of target countries so that they would fall under your corporation's control. These missions can vary in objectives and can range from capture or rescue of specific people to assassinations. Before each and every mission you have to arm and cybernetically enhance your team to prepare them for it. So understanding what was required for each to be completed successfully was a must. And properly gearing up made those challenges considerably easier. Syndicate was critically acclaimed and quickly became one of the most popular titles of 1993. I've spent disgusting amount of hours playing it back then, but now I honestly couldn't care less about it or its sequels. Funny how things change over time, right? Anyway, Syndicate is a pretty cool game that stole hearts of many geeks in the 90s and to this day is remembered fondly by many. Was T2 the arcade game great? No, not at all. But it was good enough and most importantly a port from arcades on the Amiga. And back in the 90s, whenever there was a game in arcades that I could also play at home, I was really hyped up about it. Not only because I'd save money, but also because I could experience that magic at home. And since I got my Amiga after having C64 before, the quality of arcade conversions was incomparable and very often games looked nearly as good as originals did. Not always played as well, but thankfully T2 is pretty solid in this department. It's essentially Operation Wolf but in Terminator's clothing. So you have to kill all the bad Terminators charging and attacking you using various weapons, level after level. Occasional boss and driving sections are novelty to keep the game fresh, but that's all they are, a novelty. T2 is not very inventive, but it looks and sounds pretty good, and if you like those kinds of shooters, there's quite a lot here to enjoy. And if you have an hour to kill and don't mind spending it mindlessly shooting all over the screen, you'll have a pretty decent afternoon. While Transarctica's similarities to 2013's movie and the recent Netflix series Snowpiercer are uncanny, that's all they are, similarities. As the game is based on French comic book and movie/series are based also on French but book, both by completely different authors. The world is at its end and there is a permanent winter. There are but a few small settlements of humanity left connected by long chains of train tracks that are traveled by armored trains. Transarctica is an action-adventure strategy in which you're in control of said vehicle on a quest to leave Eurasia and find a better place to settle, so in those harsh times you're chasing the sun. The game plays out in two modes, exploration and combat. In first you travel between settlements, exchanging gathered coal and gold for fuel, upgrading your train and searching for clues for your quest. In combat mode you're playing in real time, fighting against enemy trains going on parallel track to yours. These encounters start taking quite a bit of time after a while, so be prepared that it's not a short game for an afternoon. Unless you fail by losing your vital wagon, then it is. Simply put, Traps and Treasures is fantastic. It may not be as big or as full of secrets and hidden passages as Super Frog, or as compulsive and random as Robocop 2 is, but it doesn't have to be, as it's an entirely different kind of a platformer. It's not a game where you travel through huge multiple screen spanning and four-way scrolling levels. It's more linear and straightforward. You have to save your crewmates and get to the end of each level. Simple as that. Now this may sound simple, boring and perhaps repetitive, but believe me, it's anything but. Traps and Treasures is pretty difficult and requires very quick reactions, but is also incredibly fun and rewarding. On your way, you'll encounter many different pirate and marine themed enemies and obstacles, all beautifully designed and super smoothly animated. And since we're on the presentation, it's great. The game is very colorful and has its own very unique graphical style that I'm not sure I've seen in any other titles. Pretty cool addition is seemingly active, or at least scripted, music system that turns it on only in very specific situations, for instance when going underwater. The swashbuckling atmosphere is in heaps here, and for the life of me I cannot fathom a guess why Traps and Treasures didn't get more wider recognition and popularity, but I suppose it wasn't in the cards for it. Despite that, it's definitely one of the best platformers on the Amiga and a game I enjoy coming back to, even if just to fail a couple of levels in. The third and last in the trilogy, Turrican 3 is an arcade action platformer. I'd call it a Metroidvania, but since not everyone seems to be subscribing to this description, I'll stick to the earlier. It's probably a blasphemy in the eyes of fans, as creator of the series Manfred Trenz had nothing to do with this one, but I like Turrican 3 the most out of all of them. It's fast yet not chaotic, full of enemies but carefully placed and not respawning indefinitely, and poses a little challenge, but not big enough to be frustrating. The levels are a bit more linear too, but not boring, and in general you have a more general sense of where you should be going next. So yeah, while most would probably disagree, Turrican 3 is my favorite. One thing that has not changed, however, is the presentation, which is as good if not better than in previous games. It runs super smooth, parallax backgrounds scroll beautifully, and sounds, well, sound as you would have expected them to. And last but definitely not least, Chris Halsbeck's music is as awesome as usual and a joy to kick off to. If there's one thing I do not like about Turrican 3, it's the grappling hook mechanic. It's wonky at best and annoying at worst, and requires a moment to get used to. Walker is a side-scrolling arcade shooter where you control a huge mech plowing through hundreds upon hundreds of enemy soldiers and vehicles. Unusually to all other scrolling shooters, however, the screen moves from left to right. The game consists of 4 levels, each ending with a boss and each differently themed. First is set in 1944 Berlin, second in 2019 LA, third in a very generalized and stereotypic Middle East, and last in the year 2420 during the so-called The Great War. To defeat the enemies you have unlimited use machine guns and limited rockets. The guns overheat after constant use, however, so you have to manage your series of shots and not just hold the trigger pressed at all times. Well, the proverbial trigger, as you'll be clicking a mouse really. When your mech is destroyed, you lose a life. When all 3 are lost, the game ends. Graphically and sound-wise, especially if you have 2 MB of RAM, the game is pretty nice and sounds great. Gameplay is nothing to complain about either. Well, apart from getting a bit repetitive more or less 2 levels in. But destroying those small couple of pixels tall enemies is very enjoyable, so it's not something that would discourage from completing this pretty short title. While Walker was designed for one player, where joystick is used to control the mech and mouse to shoot, it can actually be played in co-op multiplayer, where each person controls one of the 2 inputs. It may sound odd, but is surprisingly fun, especially when drinks are involved. Horrorsofts of Elvira fame, game Waxworks is an RPG dungeon crawling adventure horror. Developers didn't try to hide the fact that the game was inspired by 1988's movie Waxwork, and coincidentally was their last game before they changed the name into AdventureSoft and moved on to light-hearted titles like Simon the Sorcerer. The game is divided into 5 differently themed parts: Ancient Egypt, Medieval Transylvania, Victorian England, Industrial Mine, and Iaxona's period. And apart from the last one that always has to be completed at the very end, the other ones can be approached in any order. 3 of them have combat and puzzle solving mixed more or less equally, while the Victorian England and Iaxona focus on puzzles in majority. Interestingly enough, progress between each stage resets, so each can be treated as an individual shorter adventure. While the amount of gore and gruesome deaths can be difficult to stomach for some, the game is generally speaking quite fun. While I'm not the biggest fan myself, leaning towards more traditional RPGs, I can appreciate Waxworks' qualities. Wizenless is Sonic fast action platformer developed by Raising Hell Software and published by Psygnosis. Now, since you've heard the name of the developer, just look at the graphics. Raising Hell, right? More like petting puppies. Or wabbits. Anyway, Wizenless is cutesy, incredibly fast platformer that's, for the most part, despite the pace it runs at, incredibly relaxing title. Not only cause it looks the way it does, but apart from few end-of-level bosses, it features no enemies at all. The game is divided into 8 differently themed worlds, each consisting of series of smaller levels in which you must collect wabbits that drop letters when collected and then grab those letters to form a specific word. After you do so, you can collect all the remaining wabbits for fruit, stars and clocks that increase time limit. Set time limit is working in an interesting way. It's set to 3 minutes and restarts only when your character dies. Wizenlist features some minigames and many cameo appearances from characters from other Psygnosis' games. Admittedly, I might have not played Wizenlist as much as other platformers like Super Frog or Fury of the Fairies, but it doesn't change the fact that it's really fun and with a friend in 2-player mode, much better than played alone. If you haven't had the chance, do yourself a favor, grab a friend and give it a go. Yojo is amazing. Yeah, that's how I want to start it. Because it is. It's an action platformer with exploration-based 4-way scrolling levels, plenty of hidden secrets and a lot of paths, often with more than one way leading to the level's ending. It's an unusual design choice that rewards discovery and carefully checking all nooks and crannies. The game features many different kinds of enemies, many of them with unique to them characteristics and attack patterns, but you're not helpless. You can punch and kick, and what's more, use various scattered around the levels weapons. If that wasn't enough, Yojo features both bosses and mini-bosses that you occasionally have to fight against, and in between the levels flying shoot-em-up sections, so you'll have no time to get bored here. While the graphics and sounds are exceptional, they are not the best feature of the game. What is by far the best part of Yojo is the simultaneous 2-player mode, which you may think is not something that's necessary in a platformer, and you're right, necessary it is not, but it works great, and if you have someone to play Yojo with, I recommend it as it's much more fun than playing alone. Zool 2 is much improved Zool 1 and a decent arcade platformer. For the longest time I thought that Zool games were supposed to be Amiga's answer to Sega's Sonic, especially that Zool ran around the levels very fast, he has move-based spinning attacks and tons of attitude. But similarities of both titles end there. Zool's levels scroll in all directions and allow for backtracking, which in itself is an improvement over Sonic's linear left-to-right stages, but while the levels in their design look as if they were made for fast movement, and Zool gains momentum quite easily, it's hardly a case here. Cause as soon as you start moving fast, you're being stopped in your tracks by an enemy or environmental obstacle and get hurt. Zool 2 is a good game and a decent attempt at Amiga's mascot in a platformer. But attempt is all that it is. It fails to ascend to anything better, sadly. You may have noticed that the voiceover was differing a bit in quality in this video. It's because it was recorded over a few days, or evenings to be precise really, and during one of those sessions my mic just told me to suck it and started acting up. Picking everything all around, birds singing, dogs farting, cause yeah, they do, my neighbors arguing, everything but me. So for some editing magic and Cthulhu blessings I've managed to save the recordings, but the quality difference is more than noticeable, I'm sure of it. Also, same reason for the difference in length of game previews. They've been written over 4 or 5 days, and with some I had easier days and could write more. Others I was either busy or knackered, or a combination of both, so had to keep them shorter, more brief. Oh well, such is life. Anyway, I think it's time to address the proverbial elephant in the room. Those of you who've been watching those History of Amiga Games videos from the start know that I've preached 1993 as being the very best year for Amiga games, having the coolest and most well-known titles released. And I still think that it was. But I'm not sure that you do. So let's discuss it in the comments. Prove me wrong. But whether I was right or wrong, some of the most memorable titles did release and many of them were important not only for the Ami, but for the history of gaming overall. I suppose we'll see in around a week if 1994 was anywhere near as good. For now though, if you liked the video and would like to see more, smash those like and subscribe buttons below. And if you're in a more generous mood, you may consider joining my Patreon. It would help me make better content, upgrade my editing rig and maybe even get a camera. Who knows? For this week though, this is all, so have a good one and I'll see you next time. Peace.